So today we're going to be talking about achieving automation maturity in FinOps. And, we've started this Ready to Run series, which is a series that kind of focuses on different elements of kind of future looking, how technology can better support and underpin the work that the FinOps teams are doing in organizations today. And each kind of series has an e-guide where we're talking about best practices that we've seen and we've used in our lives in FinOps, as well as what we see some of our highly mature customers doing in their practices. We've had series on AI, automation, obviously, is this one. So those are available. We sent them out as kind of precursors, and we'll share the link to those e-guides as well. Today, we're going to be focusing on automation, which is we've had a lot of questions and conversation about since kind of posting that. We'll be diving in and having a discussion around kind of how we built that maturity model, as well as talking to a few folks who have quite a background in bringing automation best practices, not only to FinOps, but to other kind of cloud operations practices. And so I think we kind of start with the headline, which is, for those of us who work in FinOps or have worked in FinOps in the past, I think this is one of those stats that we've seen time and time again that is all too real, which is 40% of organizations identify manual processes as a significant barrier to effective cloud cost management and optimization. And we've seen the curve of expectation change over the last few years for FinOps teams around kind of what their remit is. And as they're being elevated into more strategic positions in the business, these manual processes that they have been kind of plaguing this operational practice for years now are starting to become barriers to kind of growing and becoming more strategic. And so this is something that the FinOps Foundation State of FinOps report reported on, and we see this in real life. When we talk to our customers, you still see a lot of those kind of basic or operational tasks being handled by people instead of by tools and technology. And so we have to ask ourselves why. When you look out across kind of the IT landscape, it's very clear that FinOps is lagging behind other IT domains. You have practices like DevOps, SecOps, CloudOps, and others are using automation to really handle a lot of their operational components and even beyond. And yet FinOps users tend to still kind of be stuck in the trenches with manual processes. I think this is a good enough place for me to invite Kyle to kind of give his vantage point on this, because Kyle has existed in the FinOps world for a few years now, but comes from kind of a cloud engineering and DevOps background where automation was prevalent. So any observations here, Kyle, that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I mean the history here is now somewhat long in our industry, having been part of sort of DevOps transformation cycles from the beginning, and all the a sort of transformative curve from bottom up operations side of focusing on heavy toil items that were complex and painful, and DevOps brought in an engineering mindset to bring automation to those manual, painful processes. As that gained a lot of traction, it's not just in the the outcomes with automation, but on the principles of how an engineering mindset should be applied to all these different areas. So we have SecOps on here as well, and DevSecOps became a thing, and trying to that whole shift left mentality of all of these sort of next stage items that were slowing down velocity, product velocity, engineering velocity, and ultimately business value. So if you zoom through all of that, it's pretty amazing the level of sophistication that exists in a sort of modern IT stack, from very low level provisioning of bare metal infrastructure, all the way to sophisticated real time auto scaling patterns in, whether it's Kubernetes or falling over from cloud provider A to cloud provider B. real-time security detection of intrusion events and changing configurations to mitigate, et cetera. Like it's getting very sophisticated. On the FinOps side, um, I'd say it's a generation behind that traction, and it's largely been kind of getting our feet under ourselves from a financial practices perspective. Like, how do you make sense of all this data and et cetera? And that's been a swarm of humans, quite honestly, a swarm of practitioners that have been kind of starting course through that jungle, which I feel now is pretty well, charted. Like that's well paved ground now. And now the business outcome side of it, I think, is where everyone's eyes are on the sort of ROI there, and automation is at the heart and soul of that. So it's playing a little catch up there, and I hope, my strong hope, opinion, encouragement to the community here is that we should learn a lot from the patterns that have already been laid across those other domains.
Appreciate that. And I mean, listen, anybody who's in this space feels the pain. It's definitely not going to drain this slide, but clearly manual processes are always going to cause business bottlenecks. It's always going to be something where strategic decisions are being delayed. And in the world of FinOps, that usually means you're losing money, right, as you wait. And that can come in the form of like optimization opportunities, but it can come in many other forms. There's a lot of decision paralysis. And what happens is the data that was readily available, as that starts to kind of go backwards and you move far away from that relevant data, you start to have low confidence decisions because you're working off of data that is kind of out of date. There's tons of missed cost opportunities. We see that time and time again. Something is surfaced, it is available. You can see a clear, if you make this decision, you can save this much money. But it gets put into a holding pattern because it's waiting on a human to engage with it. And then there's a lot of process fragmentation. But I think, stepping away from these kind of real tangible costs of manual FinOps, there's another one that we hear quite often, which is that, the rest of the IT organization is kind of waiting for us to catch up. They're looking at us from a perspective of, okay, you're giving us a lot of insights or activities that need to get done, but you're not really giving us the means to get them done efficient. And so we're not really meeting the rest of the business where they are. When you've got the folks who are kind of hands-on keyboard, typically using tools that can automate things at scale, and then you hand them a manual task, it can be I would say disjointed, and it also kind of diminishes our role in kind of the broader IT community or ecosystem of a business. And so, you've seen in the community that this has become a center stage item, right? In the last state of FinOps, I think it was one of the top kind of increased priorities for most FinOps practitioners. We have to get automation kind of built in and weaved into our daily operations. And so, from our perspective, the time for automation was yesterday, right? So we need to get started now. And the focus of this conversation and some of the recent thought leadership pieces that we've put out is really to focus on how do you get to maturity, right? How should FinOps leaders and practices be thinking about this? What does highly mature, if you will, automation look like? And kind of what are some best practices to get started? And so that's the focus of today. We're going to talk about some of the pillars that we kind of built as a team. We are, CloudBolt is an automation forward company. We've been handling enterprise automation since essentially our inception. And so we have a lot of really smart people that kind of know what really good automation should look like. And what we've tried to do is kind of consolidate that into 5 pillars that we'll discuss today. And we'll offer up Kyle and Ryan the opportunity to speak through how folks should be kind of taking each pillar and taking it back to their business, and some best practices to get started, and maybe some pitfalls to avoid, as well as conversation around what it looks like in real life. We've got some takeaways towards the end, and we invite any Q&A as we go through this. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A. And so with that, quick introduction to those who are here. You've already heard from me. My name is Will Norton. I am a senior director of product marketing here at CloudBolt. Prior to this, I oversaw cloud practices at Cognizant Technology, where we were doing a lot of migration, a lot of FinOps work, and a ton of COE work, Cloud Center of Excellence work. Automation was a heavy part of all of that. Kyle Campos, our Chief Product and Technology Officer, as well as Ryan Wrenn, who is our VP of AI and ML, who have kind of a storied background in all things DevOps, engineering, and cloud operations. All right, so with that, we're going to kind of introduce these at a high level, and we'll go one by one. So we've tried to consolidate kind of 5 pillars of FinOps automation, of kind of mature automation, in the kind of areas or points of emphasis that you should be thinking about if you're a leader who's trying to kind of ingrain automation into your practice. We're going to go one by one, so let's start. And with each of these, what we're going to talk about is what kind of low maturity looks like, that mid-tier and high maturity. Certainly don't want to drain the slides because obviously we all can read, but let's walk through each one of these individually, and then on the next slide we're going to walk through some best practices and have a conversation. So the first is this focus on frequency and process integration, and this is really kind of the regularity of automation execution and its level of integration within business processes. So when you think about automation that is lower in maturity, it is something that is kind of run as a one-time exercise, it's sporadic, and typically it's manually triggered. So it's kind of a step beyond just doing things fully manually, but it is kind of a one-time automation. You think of things like one-time scripts that may exist that you can run in your environment, or maybe stuff that's been stitched together that requires somebody to go actually kind of start a job or a task. And then you kind of move all the way up the maturity chain. You talk about automation that is built to be continuous. It's event-driven and it's autonomous. And typically this is embedded into a larger workflow. So it's not there to do kind of one task. And it's something where you don't really need a human to be involved. And this is becoming a kind of a very big topic in the world of IT right now because of things like AI agents and some highly mature kind of automation tools that exist. So, some discussion points here. I think there's some challenges and there's some key questions. And we'll start with the challenges. Kyle, as you look through some of these, what are some of the key challenges that teams will face when they're trying to kind of go from that point in time automation into something that's more continuous or event driven without manual intervention being needed?
Yeah, there's a couple of phases here. One on the sort of insight side, being able to process a vast amount in a FinOps context, a vast amount of cost and usage data and deriving insight from that. If that's a manual process, or there is heavy amounts of manual, uh, not maybe not on the collection side, but in the evaluation side to say like, all right, what does all this actually mean? Is, 5 million of spend here, good or bad? What insight do I derive from that? If that's heavy manual process, then it's hard to then bolt on any automation downstream from that because you need to first automate how insights are derived from that. Like, how do you create rule sets and patterns that float up your abstractions above that data that float up insights that say like, hey, all this clump of data means X, right? Or it means this collection of insights. That then second stage problem is, all right, now we can attach action to that to say like, in the case of insight X, we want to take action Y. But even being provisioned with that sort of events, sort of stage of events, you got to kind of start on the left side first. Is, do we have a platform that's able to ingest data, process data, and turn around some collection of meaningful insights? It could be one, it could be many, just some set of insights that mean a specific thing that you could attach a direct action to. What, low maturity teams would do in this stage is like, hey, let's just have a meeting to review a bunch of data, right? And so you get all this um, um, non-deterministic exchange of ideas, right? Around like, well, I think this means that. I think that means that. That's really hard. This is really easy. And you get all this qualitative analysis, right? And so if you're in that sort of qualitative, non-deterministic stage, that's the first area to focus. I mean, I think FinOps has done a lot to help that stage of problem, right? It's like, okay, there are ways now to ingest all of that data and turn around a quantitative set of insights. Now, the problem that we've been pushing into is, okay, now next stage, like how do you create policies against that quantitative insight set to say, this is what we want the response to be to that, whether that's in the infrastructure side or even on the business side, right? Like this is the event we want to trigger. It should trigger an alert to team X to do something, or it should trigger an alert to pipeline Y to actually go do that thing, right? For a continuous automation perspective. Um, when all of that is, non-deterministic, the frequency is going to get less, like more lead time between each time this occurs because you're bringing in more qualitative analysis. And I would just say this area is ripe for event-driven continuous automation because you can't get anything more quantitative than actual numbers and billing data and usage that's very explicit down to a very granular level. I think the business challenge here is actually the sort of the human overlay to this, like, okay, what behavior do we actually want in this scenario? A lot of teams haven't really thought that through. It's like we've just been an analysis department, right? We just kind of, or a report factory, we just kind of turn back like the State of the Union, but we don't know what we actually want to do about it. So uh, that's kind of the early stage problem. But I'm trying to highlight both on the insight side and the action sides, two different stages of problems there.
Yeah, to build on what Kyle said, I think that, you think about these levels of maturity, you can kind of think about it as reactive in terms of the, ad hoc running of automation, scheduled, where then you have this periodic, running of things, and then proactive, which is the, continuous optimization and action. And, initially in that reactive state, like Kyle said, you're only as good as your insights. And so really your challenge is, how good are those insights? How up to date are they? How quickly do you get them? Then as you move into the, that scheduled run, then the question is, well, how valid is that schedule? How often do you need to revisit that process and redefine when that needs to happen? That's you're only going to be as good as your ability to kind of maintain that schedule. And then as you get into proactive, it's really about coverage. As Kyle said, like what actions are you able to take? And, are you able to do enough to make progress on your, FinOps objectives? It's just it's a scope question at that point.
Let's use an example for like SaaS management because I know that that's popular right now. You think about an audit that is something where there's a script that, hey, every quarter I'm going to go run this analysis to see when the last time users or how many times users have logged into a platform. I go run that script if I remember to do it. The second stage might be this is automated, right? It happens every quarter and then it delivers to my inbox. I don't actually have to run that script. It's something that the insights are kind of surfaced directly to me. Maybe there's another step where it kind of goes out to the user themselves. Then there might be something where, if it's fully autonomous, and prove me wrong here, challenge me, right? Like you have a system in place where you go, if any user has not logged in X amount of times in X amount of days, automatically, send them a note and send their leader a note, or even just kind of put their account into a suspension, right? So that you're saving the dollars. Is that the kind of curve that we're talking about here? Is that a good example, or are there any other kind of tasks that you could think about that follow that same pattern?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think that is a totally valid example. There's, even on the billing side, you were mentioning SaaS. I was just having a conversation earlier today about SaaS management automation capabilities in regards to sort of billing errors and what steps you may take if the rate you were charged is not what was negotiated, and that may trigger an event that says, "Don't approve this invoice," right? Don't pay that until we resolve that. From an infrastructure management perspective, I mean, this happens. This happens constantly from like an SRE perspective, right? I mean, in a day two sort of cloud ops SRE world, they are ingesting a bunch of telemetry, utilization telemetry. Now, it's not around in the FinOps world, utilization is hours alive, right? That's the sort of metric. In an SRE context, maybe requests per second, is the mode. And if it falls below a particular threshold, they're going to scale down, right? Like we don't need this many containers running for this service. So that's taking real insight that affects user behavior, but ultimately affects the bottom line as well. So I mean, this pattern, this model can be applied to really any part of the business and any part of the technical stack.
All right. Well, that's a good place to move on. So let's talk about human involvement and cognitive load. And really, this is just how much human intervention is required and the mental effort involved in managing the automation. So, you think about calling back on the last pillar, something that's fully autonomous, you'd hope that there's not a lot of parts in the automation that require someone to do something. And also, you'd hope that if somebody does have to kind of intervene, it's not a specialist or somebody that understands the nature of that automation or the task at hand. And so on the lower maturity side, you see kind of significant manual input, many stages of automation requiring involvement and then a high cognitive load, and all the way up the maturity scale, you think about autonomous automation. This is where I think AI and ML can play a huge part, and we're seeing that for near zero human involvement, right? You're building automation where you don't require intervention unless it's something that you desire. And then, making it to where it's accessible to where anybody can jump in and be a part of that automation without having to learn something or be a specialist. So I'll kind of move on to our discussion points, and maybe we'll start, Ryan, with you this time. What are some challenges that you see? We've got some listed here, and what are some best practices that you see around kind of taking the humans out of automation and lowering that cognitive load?
Well, I think one thing that's important to acknowledge is that, the aim here is not to eliminate humans. I don't think that FinOps is moving to a world where humans are not involved. It's really about, how can you focus those efforts on areas that are higher order and higher ROI than report creation and report distribution and chasing engineering teams for actions. These are things that struggle to scale, and so you end up in a spot where you're scaling your team just to address, these challenges that are, like we said, ripe for applying technology to address them. And I think that, as you look at the advances in Gen AI, that's where there's a lot of opportunity to drive that technology into those areas, so that you're freeing up your FinOps experts to work those higher order problems where you're looking at, scenario planning, where you're looking at forecasting, where you're really looking to maximize your cloud ROI, with the hours in your day and not spending those hours again on more of those tedious activities that scale relatively linearly with your utilization, right? So, yeah, I think that's one thing I just want to acknowledge is that there may be some skepticism that will be met with this, but again, it's about understanding that by applying technology, it's freeing you up to work higher order problems.
Yeah, I think, we've talked about this at length, right? It's like you can't automate the strategy, right? Or the process creation or the important kind of governance things. Like that requires, humans to really think about it. And that's where you think about FinOps as the strategic part of the business. They're focused on designing, right? The strategy is very important, right? But then it's like, do you need them to be enacting every part of the process every time? So like a great example is, when you work with larger enterprises, the optimization patterns typically are the same, right? If we see this kind of anomaly, then these things happen, whether it's, it hits a certain queue or there's a certain approval process or whatever. And then these types of actions are allowed to be taken. So if you've got trust in the data, you can automate a lot of that process where you don't really need that intervention to be involved, right? And so, Kyle, I know a lot of the work that we've done in the product is kind of building for that. It's like, hey, putting the humans in where needed, but hoping that, looking at like StormForge is a great example. It can just kind of run once you kind of put your strategy into code, kind of let the technology do the rest.
Yeah, I think the sort of modal switch there that I talked to teams about, I mean, as I've rolled through sort of this automation transformation from very large enterprises, like the largest insurance carriers in the United States, with a lot of legacy IT processes, there's a mode switch, which is by default, low automation, low maturity places are all lights are red, as I was communicating. Like every intersection or every leg of something, it's always default lights red. And I think the big mode switch is here. It's okay, as a next stage, let's talk about how we can make the default mode lights green as far as we can get. And you make sort of interception points of like, all right, here's where you can and disrupt that flow if required. So, I mean, a very practical example. When I was doing this for continuous delivery at a large insurance, U.S. insurance carrier, I literally walked the halls through the entire approval chain that existed and asked them, do you care at all about the deployment of this application that currently is lights red until you say yes? And they're like, I've never even heard of that application. I just say yes. And I would go down through the halls, and it was that all the way through. Nobody in that entire approval chain cared about this application at all. And so, like, all right, we're going to change that to light screen. If you need to stop something, pause something, you got to, a change, freeze, or whatever. Here's the event you send in that will stop that, right? So there's always a way to navigate that blend of human interaction and sort of automated or autonomous control. You can always find where on that spectrum you need to be, but the mode switch is we got to get out of, hey, by default, everything is blocked until a human explicitly approves, and invert that. And then you start to get people sort of, I don't know, habituated to a flow of changes instead of like it's just a pile of requests that I'll peel off one at a time. If you get people acclimated to a flow of changes, everybody's mindset starts to change around like, okay, now I interact with work in a whole different way. So I think that's just an important sort of mindset difference.
But inherent to that, what's required to get to that point, because there's a trust element here that I think we're dancing around, right? It's one of the questions on the slide. Like the technology and the systems have to be built in a way where there's observability, right? So you can see how things are working as they're working. You can do
Yep.
some sort of check, and even things like running an example automation is probably a better word that I'm not hitting, but kind of running it out and seeing, hey, what would happen if we ran this, and not actually have the changes occur, because that
It won't.
typically where the kind of the bureaucracy or the concern and trust starts. And so
Mhm.
I think it's probably worth commenting, like, the products have to be built, or systems and tools have to be built in a way where you have observability, you can run those dry runs.
Yeah.
And to your point, there can be an intervention where needed, so that there's some caution that can be handled by the teams that oversee it. Is it fair to say that? Anything else to comment on there?
No, I think that's right. And how you scope like in our product and on FinOps context, when we're talking about automation against infrastructure, there's like, hey, go actually make the change on this service, shut it down, scale it up, scale it out, or it could be tags that are applied that said like, hey, here's what we want to do, and then some second stage operation comes along to do it, or it's a notification of like, here's what I would intend to do if you allowed it through.
Got it. Yeah. So different pathways for the automation is great. All
Yeah,
right.
I would just add, within our own, as we use our own product to manage our own cloud costs, this is an area where, we track the opportunity costs of changes that we want to make, and we track the mean time to action. So, we're trying to quantify, as we do put, blocks in order to manage risk, how much those are actually costing us. And if we're seeing that time to action grow too high and that opportunity costs grow too high, then we then are armed to have that discussion to say, is it worth revisiting our process or revisiting our risk analysis, because this is what this stoplight, as Kyle put it, is costing us. Like, we actually have those metrics to look at.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the third pillar, which is, ownership and accessibility. So this is a great one. I mean, I think obviously there's who controls and oversees the automation processes, but then probably more importantly is how widely accessible is the automation to the rest of the organization. And we've seen really great examples of automation that is future thinking and very powerful, that is only accessible to a small group of people. And so the ability to kind of create widespread value is very low. Or, from the perspective of kind of, hey, there's all this automation available, people just don't know about it. They don't know where to get it. They don't know how to adapt it to their own use cases in the business. And so when you think about this, it kind of goes from and I think I got a mistake on this slide, so I'll call it out as we go through. But self-service is really the goal. So fully democratized, being able to kind of walk up, grab automation kind of off the shelf, whether it's from a tool or from some sort of area where it's kind of readily accessible to the rest of the business. Things that are maybe shared from department to department. And then really stuff that's just held and controlled by a certain team with limited access would be lower in the maturity. And so in that kind of push to get to self-service, where you make these things widely accessible to the teams and the people in the business who would benefit from it, you see some key challenges here. But maybe I'll start with a question for both of you around what are some best practices around making automation kind of widely known and widely available to the teams that can then use it. So Kyle, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is particularly challenging, and this is where kind of a lot of platform engineering thinking comes in, when you have a distributed shared responsibility model. And certainly in a FinOps context, that's always going to be the case. You're dealing at least with FinOps plus a engineering team, but in all likelihood, many different types of engineering teams.
Oh.
And so you have to make this as sort of adaptable and componentized as possible. It's not wise, certainly from a FinOps perspective, to come in with high opinions on like, this is the way to rule it all. Like this automation structure is one size fits all for everyone. So some of what we've done, this is use an engineering nerd term here, composability, which is how can you take bits of it and interact with other parts of the organization. So as an example, as we have policies, what we call waste signals, which are essentially what I was mentioning on the first pillar here, around how you are processing data to create insights. We have policies for that would attach to actions that are either the opinionated set, which are go do this one thing, or it could be an event trigger to some other system. And often this might be a engineering team's GitHub action or a Jenkins job that they've built, right? Like, hey, this is, or or a Terraform module that they have, right? Like that's what their area of control is. They have a particular span of control and infrastructure and a particular technology set that they're comfortable with. And so being able to integrate with that is really important, right? It's like, okay, low opinionation here. We just want to be able to vent into your system and let you know you got some work to do, a job to do. And in any company, product team, technology stack of any reasonable scale, you're dealing with some measure of that, right? You are not going to get high centralized control, one way to do it, knock on my door, and I'm going to tell you exactly how the world works. You have to be able to have a composable model. And this is what makes it both. There's two sides of that coin. On one side, you're like, boy, that sounds difficult. And I would say the only difficulty there is that it requires you to have good working relationship with all those different with those teams and be able to talk with them. But that interaction model, that sort of event model, is easier in a sense that you don't have to own the entire world. Now you're just sort of a little bit of a dispatching system to say, like, I have this insight and I want to trigger downstream activities with, right? So it helps you scope your field of vision down, which is a good thing. If you care about velocity and impact, it is a good thing because the broader you make that, the slower you're going to go. So you do need to kind of constrain, your scope of control as much as possible and have those types of interactions. So it's more about how you navigate distributed control, right? How you approach that. First, acknowledge that it needs to exist, and then start having those conversations. If there's any paralysis there, my encouragement would be once you start having those conversations, you'll see how much more actionable it is than the alternative path, which is like, I'm going to try to convince the entire enterprise that my way of doing it is better than the pre-existing way, right? Like just be more collaborative in that approach and you'll get more done.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there is that, to the point number three, the misalignment and automation priorities across departments. You really want to focus on the outcomes first and the tools second. If you start with a tools discussion, then basically it'll be, should we use a hammer or a pickaxe? And you'll be locked into that sort of my tool versus your tool discussion before you've even aligned on what is the core value that you're trying to deliver to the business. And if you start with that value, then oftentimes, the tooling path becomes more apparent. And as Kyle said, it really becomes then this kind of question of composability about, rarely is it one tool that's going to solve all the problems. It's going to be this integrated solution in order to solve these, business problems. So that would be my suggestion, is really focus on, establishing and aligning on those outcomes before getting into a tooling discussion. And that's where, we've seen a lot of progress in the DevOps and SecOps communities, aligning on, DORA metrics or other KPIs first, and then, using a variety of tools to improve those metrics over time.
Yeah, there's definitely been, in the first kind of wave of FinOps tools in this ecosystem, even before I worked for a vendor myself, we saw a lot of these tools be like, hey, you kind of got to come to us, right? Bring all the engineers, bring all the cloud operations people, bring them into our platform, and we'll kind of be the one size fits all. And I think you're seeing that switch right now in thought, which is how do you bring it, to the people who are operating. And then Ryan, to your point, what kind of outcomes are you looking to achieve? We did a great chalk talk at FinOps XC with Rich Young, and he was talking about a really cool example of kind of bringing the insights to the people that I thought was notable, where anytime there was a pull request, that was related to infrastructure, and there was an optimization opportunity that was outstanding, and kind of brought that front and center so that those changes could be kind of thought through and put into the push, right? So that's a good example of kind of, aligning with the outcomes and then bringing, things to where your users, if you will, in the business are working. And then listen, from a marketing perspective, I'd be remiss not to at least mention on this one that there is a level of enablement and marketing that you have to do within the business, right? People don't know that automation exists or that tooling or services exist if you don't, share the wins, talk about how they work, and get people the resources they need. And oftentimes, you have people not adopting, really cool automation patterns or tools in general, mostly just because they don't know it exists and how to use it. Okay? So I think it's important that, FinOps leaders pick up the mantle on that one. All right, let's move on. So as we talk about adaptability and scalability, this really refers to how easily automation systems can be modified to meet new needs. And while scalability is addresses how well these systems grow to support more users or processes. And I think, Kyle, you just talked about a lot of stuff that I think is relevant here. You think about low maturity as kind of bespoke, just automation that was purpose built for one thing or a set of things. And then all the way up the chain, you talk about productized, which in a lot of ways means kind of modular and adaptable in kind of the newer terms. And so maybe we kind of build on, Kyle, what you were talking about, and what are some best practices or maybe some technology patterns that FinOps leaders should be leaning into as they go to design kind of dynamic and scalable automation?
Yeah, this is tough. This is always a sort of shifting ground underneath your feet. So I guess my first call out here would be is you will always have a day two of everything you create here, and so it is not a sort of one-time build and off you go. My general guidance here is, I think you will, going from 0 to 1 here, I think certainly you want to go for an easy, low-hanging fruit that starts to build some of that confidence and trust that you were talking about earlier on. And oftentimes that might be a little bit more statically built. So the sort of key challenge here. And you can avoid that. What I think the trap here is to make something that is scoped small, but isn't statically mapped. So as an example, a small scope might be, we want low-hanging fruit, stale volume snapshots. Easy for people to reason about, to say, like, we don't need those. Those are costing us money. All we really have to think about is the safety conditions that we think we might need something like that, right? So instead of saying, like, well, a manual process would be every month we're going to evaluate that list. A next automated process might be, okay, if we think monthly is the right period, every 30 days we're going to have a cleanup cycle go. Avoiding that sort of static map might be like, well, where I'm only going to look at things that were tagged this specific way or a part of this one account, right? You have some static mapping that it doesn't allow it to adapt to the operational changes that will occur. People are going to create more accounts that'll get linked into your FinOps platform. That problem scope will grow, right? Are you going to now create some calendar entry that says, someday I'm going to look back at this problem and make sure I add another tag in there for us to evaluate, right? So that's a little bit of difference, right? You can scope the problem small to a low-hanging fruit, but you want to have your automation to be able to adapt to growing or shrinking need there in a reasonable way that isn't violating some of your safety guards. Like we mentioned, 30 days, stale. It might be the the triggering event, right? So I would just say that's a mark of maturity in how you approach the automation that says, let's make sure that the way we automate this can follow along with sort of day two operational changes in a reasonable way, and at least be aware of the areas where like it would break or it wouldn't track this type of change. Maybe it's cross account, right? Like we're not limiting it to any tag scope or anything like that, but it is limited to this account. So that means if we created a new account, we have to kind of re-provision all of this thinking, right? So at least be aware of those types of things, because that I always use the phrase that future Kyle will hate the decision I just made, right? So you think about the future versions of yourself that would look back on that. Um, I think the unknown data sets on the key questions here is kind of the one of those sort of provoking data points to help you think through that, right? It's like the changing data set may be an account ID. Like, is that a meaningful distinction for our automation? Like, do we care? Do we not care? Right? Um, yeah, that's where my head goes on this one.
Yeah, I think this is almost like any engineering challenge where it's like, how are you capturing your assumptions when
Mhm.
you this implementation? And the way that we do that in product development, for the product here that we're building here is through testing, right? And through automated testing. And so I think that, thinking through kind of the day two needs of the automation that you're building and making sure that you're building in some amount of testing to understand when your automation breaks, to check against some of the constraints and assumptions that you made when you develop the automation is valuable. Basically build for scale and make sure that you have some visibility into when the scale maybe exceeded your initial requirements.
Cool. We'll keep chugging along here. I think this last one most important, and it probably is an important place for me to say that you're not going to get high maturity in every one of these pillars for every piece of automation you build. But if there was kind of a grounding, sobering place to really ensure you're focusing, it's always going to be in value creation and business impact. And sometimes it may seem kind of like a trivial thing that you're solving with automation. It could just be one, task that's taking your team, 20, 30 minutes a quarter. But if you get it right and, over 2, 3 years, you just reduce that time wasted. It's pretty efficient, right? That has a ton of efficiency. Some stuff that you build is going to have kind of enterprise wide uh, value and even push you kind of into a competitive advantage place. But I think it's important as you kind of look at the maturity. Is this a tactical thing we're trying to focus on, or is this more transformational? Or can we take something that is tactical that we're trying to solve one pain point and reimagine it to be something that can be far more strategic or far more transformational? And so with that, any best practices that you have seen in your path, Ryan and Kyle, around how you kind of get it right from the design stage? There's a question here around, KPIs. I think that's an important one. We're always kind of drowning in the cost savings KPI, which is obviously a great one in the world of FinOps, but more and more discussion around efficiency, more and more discussion around scale and how you're servicing your population and your business, and those are maybe a drift away from cost. So, Kyle, do you want to start with kind of how you think about things as you're designing?
Yeah, I think the call out here around aligning with the business's strategic objectives is easier said than done for a lot of teams, I would say, because the delta between, or the gap between the execution teams of what often was born of tactical necessity, meaning like understand cloud costs, right? And that was kind of an obvious business impact of like we don't know what we're paying for, right? And so that was kind of, I don't know, phase one of FinOps to understand that problem. But now it's like, what else? Like we've gained the understanding. What do you want us to do with it? that often exposes a lot of disconnect between sort of business strategy and the execution teams in a FinOps context. So I empathize with that. So as I talk through this, I don't want to make it seem like that isn't a problem to overcome. That being said, let's say there's executive sponsorship there and good communication path. Often at an executive level, there's every year that the need there may shift a little bit and may be around, hey, we have this growing product launch and we're nervous about right now. We don't know how to measure the ROI of this product launch. Is this a profitable endeavor for us or not? Or we expect it to be profitable over these next 2 years, right? How do we track along with that? And so that may float up as a top level priority. That unit cost tracking across that product line is going to be very important. So how do we measure that, right? And what KPIs are important to that? It may be more generic and like, hey, we just like the entire cloud spend line, like what we're sending to cloud provider X. Our suspicion is that's way too high, right? And so we need to get a handle on that. So KPIs start floating, like the insight to action lead time, which is a very important one for us, which is the delta between when you understand insight side that there is waste in your system to the point in time that you actually do something about that. Is that a 6 months span of time, or is that 6 weeks, 6 days, 6 hours? That can move the needle in millions of dollars over a year, right, for you. So that's a very important KPI to understand and instrument in your platform, which we have obviously done here. So the long-term business goals around this might not be the tactical ones and twos. Hey, this quarter we shut down 500, stale EC2 instances or something like that. But instead, it's we drove our insight to action lead time from 6 months to 6 days, which means going forward, we have cut out 30% of our running waste at any point in time, right? New product initiatives spin up. We know we're 30% more efficient than we were. And that's a strategic business value that will carry forward, right? So you've just kind of transformed your entire organization into a next stage of maturity, which sort of compounds value for the business, right? You get to recoup that savings day over day over day. First is what are the KPIs, the measurement structures that really identify the key problem? How do you communicate that value back to the business, the executives in their own language, whether it's unit cost, insight to action lead time, things like that, optimization measurements, things like that are meaningful. That's I think some of the main challenge points that come to mind on this slide for me.
All right, cool. Well, I appreciate it. In the focus of time here, I'm going to kind of move on and do a bit of wrap up. So, I think 4 overarching takeaways that I hope everybody can kind of leave with. The first is, I think it's always important to start small. Identify a process to automate. Focus on it. Bring the smart people in. Really understand what the goals are. And try to align them best with the goals of the business. Scale incrementally. If you build things the right way, which I think Kyle and Ryan have given a lot of great examples of how you can do that and the kind of design patterns, you should be able to build over time. And then, as always, measure, adapt, and optimize as you grow. It's not going to be perfect at first, but if you start off with the right kind of compass and map, you're really focused on kind of tuning the knobs as you move forward, you'll end up with something that can be very valuable. And so, as we wrap up, I want to invite everybody to, if you are looking to kind of automate your kind of manual activities in your FinOps practice today, we're doing some really cool things here at CloudBolt that have a heavy emphasis on automation. with a lot of the kind of best practices baked in that we just talked about. So wherever you are on that maturity curve, we would invite you to reach out to us, and we can show you all the great things that we have in our platform today and kind of where we're headed. And then, just to wrap, if you have yet to read the ebook, we're going to send that back out to everybody on the follow-up email, as well as the recorded version of this. Book a demo with us if you'd like to chat more, and then follow us on LinkedIn. We're going to have more of this series coming out in kind of smaller bites, things like blog series, all the way up to ebooks and more webinars such as this. So really appreciate Kyle and Ryan, all the great insight here, and look forward to hearing from everybody who got a chance to see this and having hopefully some conversations in person. So thank you both, and everybody have a great rest of their week and holiday.
Thanks all.